of course, no one knows this, but you were a senior, and your name was Erin Brown at that time.
Yeah.
You were a senior, and you were one of my top students in my very first year of teaching. And I remember, as a first-year teacher, you're just scrambling to get whatever you can for the next day. And I knew sometimes that my lesson wasn't very good, but I knew that if I just threw something out there, that I could rely on you to have an opinion and run with it and, save my behind that day. So thank you. Belated more than 20 years later, you saved many a lesson for me.
Kept it interesting,
Yeah, you did, very much so. My question is, how did you approach learning? Does this vignette that I shared, does that ring true to you? How did you approach your time at Ed Fountas Academy as a student?
Yes, well, I tend to be a very interactive learner, so I loved the fact that the class was small enough, that when I raised my hand, a lot of times there would be other people raising their hand as well, but we were able to really dig in with one another. And I think I would say I still tend to really enjoy that style of learning. Even interacting with my own children, we're just... Sometimes I feel like I've created a monster because they're so, they're just so intense and always desiring to, well, mommy, what about this? And
oh, yeah. So lots and lots of why questions.
Yes, lots of why questions, but it's fun to answer them for the most part. Sometimes I'm just a little exhausted. And,
absolutely. So how did that approach? I know, like, with some students I teach, they're afraid to kind of jump in, afraid to have opinions. How did that approach you'd say you took, how did that help you as a student, as a learner, as a person?
Well, that may have been just like sort of a function of my personality, my bent, but I don't know. I guess, my background was that I had been primarily in public school almost my whole life. I did 2 years in second and third grade at a very small private Christian school because I wasn't learning how to read in the sort of fancy, trendy program that was popular at the time. And my mom and dad said, we've got to get her in somewhere where she can just learn phonics, and stuff. And it was like, voila, she's at a 5th grade reading level, after 1 year. But then, just due to various circumstances, financial, et cetera, they said, we're going to send you back to the public school. So I went back in 4th grade. So then I went from 4th grade all the way through to 10th grade in the public school system. So I think, it had just gotten to a point where, different children learn differently, but I would say it's generally in a child's favor to be in an environment where they don't just feel anonymous, they don't just feel like and that's what I was starting to feel like. I was at Oakton High School. I think there were probably about 2,000 students there. I remember just getting very depressed and feeling like, I was just never quite able to plug in where I wanted to. I was in gifted and talented classes, but I just was bored a lot, honestly, and so I was telling Dean before we met that my 2 years at Ed Fountas were almost like very remedial in the sense of repairing some of the gaps, significant gaps in my learning, that had occurred over the years in the
I never
public
would have
school
thought
system.
that. Because when I met you as a senior, you were very bright, very attentive, very eager. So did you notice a distinct difference between your public school and Ed Fountas classroom experience? Sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, just, I don't know what the motivations were for the curriculum that was chosen. I'm sure that there was a little bit of a political correctness, influencing, some of the choices that were made and whatnot. But it was sort of like they had just abandoned the trivium, that is, the cornerstone of classical education. So, Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Yeah.
So when you were here at Fountas, it was very small school, like 30, 35 people. What was it like to go from, classic public high school, 2,000 plus people to 32 people?
I personally loved it because I had been in the big, atmosphere for so long, and I'm actually a fairly introverted person. So, for me, it was very anxiety producing to get in a car and drive on 66, first thing in the morning with my older sister all the way over to Oakton. It had to do with the districting and stuff. We were sent really far away from where we actually lived. And it was almost like, I just remember those years. Like, it was just like I was in a blur, the whole time. I just didn't really, in fact, like this is a sad but kind of funny story. One of my teachers, it was her last year of teaching at Oakton, and she sat me down and had a heart-to-heart with me because she believed that I was doing drugs. Because I was so out of it during her class. She, it was always after lunch, and I would just go into a food coma, and like,
right.
I think it was like Algebra 2 or something like that.
Overstimulating environment.
Yeah, I think I just I just shut down. So for me, it was incredibly stimulating to go to like this very scholarly atmosphere, where, for the most part, like some of the kids, to be fair, were there because their parents sent them.
Sure.
But a lot of them, were very engaged with the material, and, they were smarties, and, it was fun to get to know them and just to be like, wow, there's a lot I was missing out on, and I'm so glad that I'm here now. So,
So you graduated years and years ago. How has your perspective on the education you got here shifted in your different stages of life? College, career, and now your life as a wife and mom, which of course we'll get to. How have your reflections changed, or have they remained constant kind of throughout? And what that your time at Fountas has meant to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, there are some exceptions. A child may have certain learning disabilities, and they need help to sort of bring them up in areas where they're not keeping pace. But for the most part, I think that most children do really well, in this style of learning. I think it's tried and true. And I think throughout life, it's sort of opened this world of being a lifelong learner. I mean, even as, like, we'll talk about this, but even as my choice to be a homemaker at this stage in my life, my mind is active all the time. I'm always learning. I'm always reading about things. I'm always, remaining active in areas of interest that I have. And I don't think that'll ever change, you know? So,
So you go from someone, who was very passionate about engaging with, subject matter, big ideas, political ideas. I know you were, you had some interest in music, but then you get married, you become Mrs. Edwards. Your husband's name is Lucas, and you have now 4 kids.
Yes.
Danielle, who's 9, Gabriel, 7, Ilana, who's 5, and Michael, who's 3. And so you go from, maybe you could argue this kind of heady world of, lived out there. But now you have late night feedings and dirty diapers. There's a great word, I think, for this, what happens to moms and dads to a lesser extent, perhaps especially stay-at-home moms, the quotidian aspects of life. And that's a great classical word that means kind of like the repetitive, daily, maybe almost...
The daily grind.
The daily grind.
The mundane.
The mundane. How has being a mom changed you? And what are the connections maybe between the education you got and your life as a mom?
Well, I think the perseverance you develop by being challenged educationally sets you up really well. So, I mean, just learning Latin, like going through all the, sort of repetitive elements.
Yeah, all the repetitive conjugations.
Things like
and so
that.
on.
Ironically, like I would say it to help me develop a little bit of, strength there, that I was able to sort of carry on because, psychologically, intellectually, and otherwise, I think moms nowadays have to be pretty strong, I mean, that's always been the case, but I think just because of cultural factors and unique challenges, that things that our children are getting exposed to that they weren't, back in the day, you have to have a pretty well developed sense of worldview, before you're handed this new life.
Sure.
And, responsible for influencing this new life and, hopefully for the good,
Sure.
and everything. But, yeah, I mean, it's been a lot. It's been tremendous for me, Mm-hmm.
You mentioned to me earlier as we were talking outside that in some ways, you view yourself as somewhat of a rebellious person. And now you're expressing that kind of rebellious side by doing something very traditional.
Yes. Yes.
Being a stay-at-home mom.
Yes.
Which in some circles is a controversial vocation.
Yes.
Why do you think that it is controversial? And why was it important to you to choose this path for yourself?
Yes. Well, I have a lot of thoughts in that regard.
Good.
So
Go ahead.
we may have to do a part 2 of this conversation. And this is not by any means a manifesto, but kind of like we were talking about, there's a lawnmower outside.
Yeah.
That's not a big deal.
Life happens, right?
Yes. And that's one thing you learn as a mom,
Very
for
good.
sure. You just
Very
have to
good.
roll with the punches. So I wrote, this does tend to provoke a lot of reactions. Usually I found by and large mostly support from people. And I actually know a lot of moms in the secular world. My children where I'm living now have spent some years at a secular Montessori school just in the pre-K years.
Yeah.
And a lot of those women have likewise chosen, not for any religious philosophical reason, they just felt drawn to it.
Right.
So I think largely this is controversial because, the last century, you had all these sort of hard-fought victories in the women's movement and, women just being able to have the freedom, to say, hey, like, I have the intellect and the motivation, to have the sort of job that would have traditionally been filled by a man, So while I'm totally grateful for the way that those freedoms have opened up for women and women have proven themselves, and I'm grateful for a lot of the endorsements that women have had, I think one of the unintended consequences of that is that it has sort of devalued the role of being a wife and a mother and choosing to be a stay-at-home mom and be the one to be the primary person in your children's life versus outsourcing that, sort of to the professionals, like, so I can go live my professional life and, we have a quick dinner at the end of the night, story time, go to bed, do it all over again, So
do you think that, I'd be curious for your thoughts on this, do you think that some women might view your choice as a betrayal of some of those victories?
Yes, absolutely. Were you finished?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. Yeah.
I actually read a book a few years ago, and again, this was by like a self-proclaimed feminist. It's actually a book called Radical Homemaking, and the cover is really funny. It's sort of this tough lady in an apron holding a rolling pin up, sort of in defiance,
Yeah.
type of thing.
Another rebellious homemaker.
Yes. So what were you asking me about that? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you
Yes.
think that some women view it as a betrayal
Yes.
of some of those victories that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. I think, there is sort of this mentality of like, we fought so hard to get out of the kitchen, you
Right.
know, like why would anyone voluntarily go back to this domestic servitude type of arrangement, you
Right.
know? So yes, I have encountered that mildly at times. I definitely know it's out there in the media and stuff like that. One of my funniest experiences in this regard was when I went to just sort of a routine dental cleanup, and the receptionist was a young girl. You know, she was a millennial. I'm technically a millennial too, but because I'm rebellious, I'm like, well, I'm actually considered at the very edge of that group, and I don't identify very much at all
Right.
with some of their values. But she saw that I had actually written homemaker as my occupation on my thing, and she was like, "What does that mean? Do you work for a magazine? You know, named like Homemaker or something?"
Yeah, like right.
And I said,
Homemaker
"No,
magazine.
sweetie, that's actually like a real term. You know, that has a history." And she was actually very intrigued by it
Oh,
because
yeah,
she was
great.
actually a young mom, you know, who was working full time.
Sure.
But yeah, so
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Now, of course, you have your kids, and that involves, of course, teaching them. You also came back to teach at Fountas for a year.
yes.
What was that experience like, and does that impact you at all? Do you ever reference that now with your kids in terms of the does it how you see them or how you parent or how you educate them?
Well, I mean, they're still fairly young, so we're not going over material that's quite as sophisticated
Sure.
as what I was teaching. You know, I was doing 10th grade English. And I just did that part-time because I was also very interested in politics and did some internships in the political realm. But so I was splitting my days between those two things that year. But yes, I mean, I think anytime, you know, you go from sort of sitting back with your arms folded, just taking all the information in, to then having to go into that rhetorical stage of like, now I'm actually communicating this to other people in a thoughtful way, you know, and a way that they're able to perceive and understand so that they can take hold of it. I mean, I think I learned a lot that year. I definitely made some mistakes. There's things that I would go back and change, but yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it. It's just that I explained earlier, you know, the combination of some of the, you know, it's worse now, but even back then, you know, the political environment, there was a lot of toxicity. And I think just getting kind of burned out being a first-year teacher in combination with sort of witnessing some things that were difficult for me to process at that stage in my life, I decided to go study music.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I had enough time and money, I'd probably be somebody who's always just going back to school for something or other. But yeah.
So you mentioned some of the toxicity in our culture, and I mean, it's obvious to anyone who looks at the news. How do you see you saw it you saw it impact you? It was hard to process when you were younger. How do you see homemaking, building a family, as an antidote to some of that chaos and toxicity that we see?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there were a few key institutions that God created, you know, throughout the history of mankind. And the very first one essentially was the family. You know, you had man and wife, and then he said, go and multiply, you know. And I think anytime that we prioritize as first place something that God prioritizes as first place, whether we see all of the benefits or the things, you know, in the long run that are going to play out as a result of that, you know, there is a reward in that, you know. And I feel like already, you know, my daughter, who's 9, is very smart and gives me a run for my money all the time. But she's already becoming sort of like a little apologist, you know, for the gospel and also just for traditional values. because they see it lived out. You know, am I perfect? No. Is my husband perfect? No. Do we always set a great example? No. But we do. Do I need to speak a little closer? Oh, yeah. But, you know, all of that is just to say that I think it's an antidote in the sense of, because it's been so devalued and because it's been, you know, considered so unnecessary and all these other things, you know, you really stand out when, you know, you put that sort of in its first place.
Sure.
You know?
Absolutely. Well, that's a wonderful testimony, Erin. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'd love to, as we send you off, I'd love to ask you one final question. What would you say, someone entering at Fountas, what's going to be their biggest challenge and what's going to be their biggest reward from their experience here?
Biggest challenge, I think, just potentially stepping up to the plate with the expectation of just like, we're going to get to work, you know, and you're going to learn a lot. Some people really enjoy that. Some people it's more challenging and difficult. So I would say that would be the biggest challenge. Just the mass of information and exposure, and
you're going to have to buckle down.
Yeah, just high expectations. High expectations. You know, but the biggest reward is the other one would be the flip side of that. You know, just everything that comes out of, you know, getting down and opening up your mind to things that you didn't conceive of before, you know. But also challenge, but also reward would be like the spiritual side. Just, you know, moving forward, God made our minds so amazing, you know, if we're willing to feed them the right stuff, you know. So it can be a challenge to get kids off of video games and, you know, all this stuff, you know, that they would rather be doing. My children fight me all the time to watch more movies and more TV and all this when I'm really just trying to get them to read a book, you know.
Right.
But then they learn something once, you know, I've actually gotten them to sit down and read that book, and, you know, they're smarter and they're better off than, you know, when they started. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Yeah.
It's great for you to stop by, and it's great to see how your life has gone and how all of things have come together as the mother of four and a wife, and you're doing great. And
thanks, by God's grace, you know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been wonderful for you to be here.